Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Acts video. All right, we're checking back in with one of the most ignored crises of this millennium, and that is what has been going on in Sudan for decades. Honestly, ever since the decolonization period back in the 1950s all the way to the present. Now, Warfronts has covered this, and they put out a video the other day that's getting a lot of views. I want to see what's going on. It's called "The World Ignored Sudan's Genocide. Now It's Too Late." All right, so I want to see if there's any kind of updates, if you want to call it that. But I hope to interject at least a little bit of history into this, fill in potentially any gaps. Our original video is linked down below. Make sure you're supporting Warfronts. Give that view, like it, subscribe to their channel. Let's check this out. Okay, we'll let this thing start and chime in as we see fit. Here we go.
More people could have died there in 10 days than have died in the past 2 years of the war in Gaza.
These were the words of the executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale School of Public Health, Nathaniel Raymond, in an interview.
I mean, how sad right there when you hear about how much coverage, what's going on with Israel and Gaza, to see something that blows it out of the water when it comes to the scale of it.
Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale School of Public Health, Nathaniel Raymond, in an interview with Al Jazeera just last week. He was speaking about the fall of Fasher, the capital of North Darfur that was overrun by the paramilitary rapid support forces after over 550 days of siege. The siege that was followed by bloodletting on a scale unimaginable even by the grim standards of Sudan's civil war. When the RSF stormed the city, long the last holdout of the official Sudanese armed forces, it did so with the sort of bloodthirsty glee not seen in modern warfare for a long time. Civilians were chased through the surrounding desert, rounded up and butchered en masse. Door-to-door ethnic massacres were carried out, leaving bloodstains so vast they could be seen from space.
Gosh, you can go back to that. I don't want to pull up too many graphic things, but you remember, this is the desert. This is the Sahara. The Sahara is as big as the United States is. There's not a lot of places to flee a genocide, especially if the international community is going to be quiet about it and not really intervene, which has been the case for decades.
The last functioning hospital was breached, and every doctor and patient remaining inside was butchered by the victorious fighters. At the time of writing this on Friday, tens of thousands of people remain unaccounted for. Satellite imagery has picked out mass graves being hastily dug at the edges of the city. In a joint investigation between Britain's Sky News, Sudan War Monitor, and Lighthouse Reports, the authors referred to killing fields where the paramilitaries carried out their crimes.
To my British friends, you know, Sudan used to be a colony of the British until the 50s. How much is covered in your media, in your local media, about current events in former colonies that have roots in kind of the decolonization era? Is it ever brought up, or any kind of connections ever made to their history with, you know, your colonialism? If yes, what did they say? If no, do you think it should be?
And now, this estimated death toll from Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab, an estimate that would suggest that nearly 69,000 people were slaughtered in just 10 days. But while news out of Fasher has been horrific, this is not a video about the fall of the city and the bloodbath that followed. I mean, it is, but not exclusively. Instead, this is a video about the wider war in Sudan, a war in which atrocities as horrific as those in Fasher have been carried out, albeit at a smaller scale, for 2.5 years. 2.5 years in which over 400,000 people are thought to have been killed, in which entire cities have been sacked and burned, in which part of the capital of Khartoum was transformed into execution sites where untold civilians were tortured to death. A war.
You know, what's crazy about what's happened in Sudan ever since the 50s until now is that there will be these parallel wars or genocides going on. Think of it like a Venn diagram, and you have the big circle of like a larger civil war between North and South, and we'll see what kind of chances we get to talk about that. But then within that, there will be power struggles and smaller conflicts, more regional conflicts. So you got conflicts on top of conflicts.
In which fellow horsemen of the apocalypse, famine, has stalked the lands, leaving stick-thin, glassy-eyed children in his wake.
By the way, good chance if you live in the United States, you've seen Sudanese refugees, unless you live in an extremely rural area. this is going to explain why that exists. You might look at those people very different when you hear about what's happened.
Most of all, though, this is a video about a world that knew what was happening, a world which at last seems to be waking up after the horrors of Fasher, but which could have easily prevented the massacre from happening in the first place. Now look, before we get into all of that, we just want to clarify what we mean when we say the world ignored Sudan. To be clear, we're not saying that you personally sat there watching this on your phone in Toronto, New York, or London. Hello there, should feel guilty. Honestly, we get it. Life is hard. The world's insane. And there's only so much empathy any normal human can expend before they just want to give up and collapse on the sofa and watch some Netflix.
So sad to say that, huh? You know, when I was in college in the mid to late first decade of the 2000s, that's when I remember especially starting to hear about that, because the Darfur, specifically that region of what today would be Western Sudan, and even like the independent Sudan, because there's going to be there's going to be a Sudan and then eventually independence for South Sudan. But in the southern part of Sudan, meaning the northern part, before actually there was the split, I had heard about, I remember Darfur. And when you're on a college campus, you hear about a lot of things like this, because there'll be, you know, student protest or just student acknowledgement of things. And you hear about that. And this was going on at a time, and this was kind of starting in Darfur as the United States wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were really starting to pick up. And I remember there was kind of this argument about a hypocrisy of some kind, if this is supposed to be like a humanitarian effort in like Iraq or Afghanistan to, you know, liberate those people of the horrors of those regimes. And they bring a place like Darfur, which place like the United States didn't have all the economic investment and history, whether it was from Iraq and that region for resources, or of course responding to the attacks of 9/11 and Al-Qaeda operating out of Afghanistan, but kind of brought in this message of global hypocrisy that was going on in a place like Darfur, where you had brutal genocide basically going on, and the international community, the UN, doing basically nothing. But we'll see. There's a lot more context to talk about that. I want to see if he gets to it.
Really been enjoying that Pluribus show. It's on the sofa and watch some Netflix. Really been enjoying that Pluribus show. Nor are we saying, oh, that's on Apple TV. Nor are we saying that literally.
By the way, y'all watch Death by Lightning, about assassination of President James Garfield. Check that out if you're looking for some Netflix. But at the same time, you say we watch it too much and are ignoring these atrocities.
Show.
Maybe not yet.
Nor are we saying, oh, that's on Apple TV. Nor are we saying that literally no one has been covering Sudan's atrocity exhibition. Dedicated outlets like Sudan War Monitor have been tracking the horrors since day one. Brave Sudanese journalists have risked death to report from the front lines. In the West, experts like Alex Duvall, analysts like Cameron Hudson, various outlets ranging from The Spectator to our little YouTube channel have relentlessly covered this topic, trying to make the world care. And yet, no one gives a shit. Aside from the very opening days of the war, Sudan never really trended on social media. No mass protests called for the governments of the United States, France, or Great Britain to stop selling weapons to the RSF's main backer, the United Arab Emirates, despite mountains of evidence that Abu Dhabi was funneling Western military kit to the paramilitaries.
The whole message, I remember when this started coming out, that especially from Darfur to the present, so we're talking the last 20 years, was the hypocrisy of American economic investments, where you had stuff like that in, say, like the Middle East, you know, tying to United States repeated efforts for like regime change in somewhere like Iraq, or the supporting of Israel in Saudi Arabia. But you didn't have that in a place like Sudan. So remember the hypocritical discussion that people were trying to propose was, is that what it takes to have powerful UN countries like the United States to actually intervene in something like a genocide in a place that doesn't have those type of American economic investments? And it was very easy, you know, to point those out and draw those connections. Do you think that still reigns true, you know, 20 years into this now? What do you think? But you can see the paper trails, right, already.
Evidence that Abu Dhabi was funneling Western military kit to the paramilitaries. No one boycotted Emirates Airline, hung Sudanese flags, or tweeted hashtag I stand with Sudan. And this is just as true of countries in Africa as it is of Europe, the Americas, or Asia.
Well, let's be honest, dude. I mean, Americans have zero idea about any kind of context or what Sudan is and what its history is or what the issues are. Now, it doesn't take a ton of just basic news and basic history. You can get, a decent idea. Maybe not all the nuances, but you can at least get a understanding, or at least a level of understanding that you could have going into conflicts the United States has been a part of.
Days after Fasher fell, the African Union proudly tweeted about its hashtag silencing the guns and hashtag Agenda 2063 aspirations, including, quote, the Union's capacity for early warning, political engagement, and timely action to prevent atrocities. Of the atrocities that had just taken place in Sudan, there wasn't even a mention. Meanwhile, neighboring nations helped.
And again, what did the African Union do in this? With this being in their backyard, their own union of nations, what intervention have they taken part of, and to what scale? I personally don't know. What was the response of the neighboring countries and neighboring multinational organizations in Africa? What role have they attempted to play in all of this?
In Sudan,
has it just been condemnation? Has it been silent?
Meanwhile, neighboring nations helped fuel the conflict. Chad allows the UAE to fly weapons for the RSF into a secret airbase near the border. Kenya hosts the RSF's leader, a warlord known as Hemeti, as he seeks legitimacy for his parallel government built upon the bones of Darfur's black African minorities. Libya, under General Haftar, allows smuggling to the RSF across its borders. Further afield...
Okay, there's a lot of missing context as he is starting to put this together. Let me explain a little bit of basics. Sudan was a colony of the British in the 1800s into the 1900s. There was an actual attempted colonization effort that the British were trying to go through to basically connect colonies north, starting in Egypt, all the way south to South Africa, and have a whole string of colonies that the British could control, create a trans-African railroad, that sort of thing. So anyway, British had colonized it. Now, if you know anything about the colonization that went down in the 1800s, the kind of new imperialism, the 1800s into the 1900s, one of the famous things is that colonial borders were not drawn or really taking much into consideration the pre-existing ethnic and religious borders that exist in those regions. What you have as Sudan, especially when you connect what it used to be like with just South Sudan and Sudan being together, has an extremely diverse makeup, especially from north to south, although it's sprinkled throughout some different areas. In the north, there's an Arab Muslim majority. And then in the south, a sub-Saharan black diverse community of Christian, indigenous animist beliefs, and that sort of thing. There's a big cultural division, linguistically, racially, ethnically, linguistically, all type of that, all types of division like that. And of course, when the British leave, as did many colonies after World War II, many colonists, that left that division still with under a pre-existing border. So as new governments were being created here, you had these ethnic divisions, and without a strong, successful effort at possibly making a secular government that really is going to try to protect the rights of everybody equally, what ends up happening is factions developed, right? South Sudan, very fearful that an Arab Sudanese North, Muslim Arab Sudanese North would discriminate against the South. And there was, evidence of that. So right there, you had civil war basically between North and South. Eventually, provisions were made that there could be a referendum, and that happened in the South. That there could be a referendum for the southern part to get its independence. Now that officially went down that referendum in 2011, and the South overwhelmingly voted to become an independent state. But even with those now new north-south borders, you still had pockets of ethnic groups in the north, right? You still had non-Arab, non-Islamic groups, especially in Darfur, which was out in the west, which actually paralleled the conflict before the Sudanese split and then continued after, as in Darfur, you still had a lot of those persecuted people still in those regions. But then within that, you had militant groups that come into power. And this happens all the time in Africa when there is not a stabilization in government. There's too many factions competing for government positions or majority rule, whatever it is. It often descends into militarism. Who can raise a military up? And then you become a country that is based usually off a military dictatorship. And in the north, you had that. And you had competing militaristic groups up north in Khartoum. And there was more recently a civil kind of break or war, up there in the north in Khartoum of different military factions that are breaking apart, right? This is where we're getting those Venn diagrams and like chaos within chaos of each other. But anyways, that's a little bit about the history going into this so far about the different ethnic groups and how they have fought each other.
Russia long supplied the powers, smuggling to the RSF across its borders. Further afield, Russia long supplied the paramilitaries before switching to support the SAF when they appeared to be winning. Now, there are some who would say it's in poor taste for me, a white European, to sit here criticizing African leaders for their inaction on Sudan when my own government is doing oh so very little to help. And to that, I'd say, well done, G.
And was, again, part of the transition process from being a colony, and then in 1955, them getting their independence. And as they left, the British largely handed power over to the northern Arab elite inside of Sudan, who became the driving factor in Sudanese state development. Now, more peaceful, more neutral, more secular agreement that went down back in the 1970s got completely shattered in the 1980s. When the Sudanese president declared that Sudan was going to be an Islamic state under Sharia law, which was seen as, a total, betrayal of the more secular agreements that had happened in the past. And that brought into conflict that even that its direct influence, basically went from the early to mid 80s all the way to like 2005, which is going to overlap with the Darfur crisis as well. So the British had a role to play in this. So I was asking you earlier about how does former colonial news get covered in Britain, or if the hand's been completely, washed of it.
And my own government is doing oh so very little to help. And to that, I'd say, well done, genius. That's the entire point. By this, I mean the blind eye turned towards Sudan's suffering is a global problem. This is not some Biden-era meme about white people like me being too racist to care. Rather, it's a crisis that the wider world has collectively closed its eyes to. You can travel today to East Asia or South America and meet people who have passionately held opinions about Gaza or Ukraine, but for whom Sudan's war is not even a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. And
now we talked about how maybe American views on kind of foreign politics and foreign situations has differed. But, he was talking about how this is a global issue. So from a global perspective, why do you think there is such a disparity when you're talking about the outcry for a place, again, like Gaza or Israel versus a place like Sudan, which, again, like he's saying, when you add up the numbers, dwarf it. What do you guys think? Is racism just a convenient term to throw at it? Or economics the driving factor of it? What do you think?
let's be clear, this is not and never has been a small war. Even before the likely slaughter of tens of thousands in Fasher, Sudan's conflict was shaping up to be one of the worst so far of this century. The exact figures of how many have died are open to debate because, as Nathaniel Raymond of Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab has repeatedly noted, many who would do the counting are dead or displaced. By that he means that so many hospitals and morgues have been destroyed, so many doctors killed, so many academics and potential monitors driven to flee, that accurate data is almost impossible to come by.
Do you think that's a kind of a cop-out as well? That just the news of it, the media coverage, the data is not there? I mean, it could definitely play a role, that's for sure, but what do you think?
And this compounds a pre-existing problem in Sudan of exceptionally poor record-keeping. Health Policy Watch points out that during the pandemic, it's estimated that Khartoum accurately recorded a mere 3 to 6% of all COVID deaths. So, tracking the war's impact would be tricky even if it hadn't seen most hospitals reduced to rubble. But tricky is not the same as impossible, and there have been rigorous attempts to reach at least a decent estimate of the toll Sudan's war has wrought. One of the most respected was released by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine at the end of 2024. Focusing only on the first 14 months of the war, from April 2023 to June 2024, and centered only on the Great Khartoum area, it estimated that
the Khartoum, major historical city, a capital, used to be this incredible place, and you have tens of thousands that die in your capital. Like it seems impossible to hide.
To June 2024 and centered only on the Great Khartoum area, it estimated that the capital region had seen some 61,000 deaths in that time period. And here, we do need to put in an important caveat alert. The 61,000 figure was all-cause deaths, meaning it included people who died of normal things like cancer or car accidents and who would have likely died even without the war. Remove those, and the excess deaths from this era, a measure I'm sure we can all remember from COVID, was closer to 26,000. On the other hand, that's 26,000 people killed in 14 months. And that was just in Khartoum State, a place that hadn't yet seen truly savage fighting. While the researchers refrained from estimating an overall death for the wider war, they did note that the true number of fatalities likely exceeded the highest estimates then available. Well, at that time, the highest estimate was from the now former US Special Envoy to Sudan, Tom Perriello, who stated in May 2024 that 150,000 may have been killed. He since revised.
There's literally like American diplomats in the region, and it's like no one's ever heard of that guy.
Stated in May 2024 that 150,000 may have been killed. He since revised that figure sharply upwards, telling the New York Times in September this year that the death toll had likely crossed 400,000. That would make Sudan's civil war one of the worst conflicts fought in decades. More to the point, it shows that there were credible estimates out there of the true extent of the...
I mean, it's more than that. That ranks up with some of the most famous wars we've ever talked about, even heard of.
More to the point, it shows that there were credible estimates out there of the true extent of the fighting long before Fasher fell. Credible estimates that the international community basically responded to with the diplomatic equivalent of a sad face emoji. Yet it's not just the sheer scale of the fighting that makes it so goddamn weird that this war has been overlooked. Nor is it just the atrocities, it's also the fact that the Darfur region of Sudan may now be playing host to a genocide. If there's one thing that you need to know about the Rapid Support Forces, it's that they are a direct descendant of the Janjaweed militia that carried out the original Darfur genocide in the early years of the 21st century. In its simplest form, that genocide was an attempt by nomadic Arab herder tribes to cleanse Darfur of settled black African groups like the Fur, Masalit, or Zahawa. While such distinctions would not be visible to Western eyes, drop a member of either side into Midtown America and they both would be coded as black, in Sudan, it was enough to unleash a slaughter. If that sounds like...
Yeah, the Janjaweed, they're part of the Darfur conflict. These were local Arab militias that just like unleashed terror, ethnic cleansing of the Darfur region, right? Aimed at the people that aren't of that same ethnicity, religious type. Meets like the exact requirements of what you're talking about, a genocide, which is, you know, a very directed system of violence against a specific group of people, with it in it being civilians.
A little bit like the more things change, the more they stay the same. Well, know that there's one crucial difference. In the 2000s, the Darfur genocide was international news. News people
I'd heard about it.
Here's how the Holocaust Encyclopedia.
But again, forget, in the West, there was also the war in Iraq and Afghanistan going on at the same time. Got pushed under the rug. Now, if those things hadn't been going on, would there have been more attention? Maybe even became a priority? Those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan weren't going on. I don't know. Maybe. What do you think? Were those just too distracting?
It describes that time. Human rights advocates organized public protests and campaigns in communities around the United States and globally Today, the RSF tries to finish the work its predecessor organization started. The idea of mass protests against their crimes seems just like the stuff of fantasy, though. Few regular people today even know that a genocide is happening in Darfur. The reasons for this are complex and include the Sudan war having the misfortune to run parallel to two conflicts the world really does care about, Ukraine and Gaza. But it could also be due to events in other parts of Sudan swallowing up any precious airtime that was dedicated to the crisis.
Oh, that is crazy how this very current conflict has been going on since 2023, so a couple years now. Going on exactly with the height of Ukraine, Russia, and Israel and Gaza. It's like the worst possible timing for the Sudanese to have eyes, fixated on that.
Unlike Sudan's previous civil wars, the current conflict erupted in the capital Khartoum with a showdown between the SAF and RSF. And if you want more details, we've got an upcoming 72-minute documentary on the war's backgrounds that we're just putting the finishing touches on. But the key part for today's video is that the sight of landmarks in the capital being bombed by fighter jets and shelled by artillery naturally focused scant media attention on the center of the country. And that means few were watching as the RSF opened a second theater in Darfur, turning the entire region into a zone of horror. Now, it's important to note that the RSF are not the only war criminals in Sudan. Their principal rivals, the SAF, have repeatedly bombarded civilian areas, mass executed those suspected of working with their enemies, and have been accused by the United States of deploying chemical weapons on the battlefield. They've withheld food from starving.
Chemical weapons, I mean, that's something people cite as like the line, don't cross. It was used justification for first Gulf War, and the United States goes in to protect Kuwait against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, against Bashar al-Assad in Syria, using chemical attacks. Right? It's this thing is supposed to be internationally just a line you do not cross. Except it has been crossed, apparently.
Cities. Their current war effort is backed by Iran, and they are becoming dangerously intertwined with violent Islamist groups as the conflict drags on. Nice people? They're emphatically not. But the RSF is just orders of magnitude worse. Sudan expert Alex Duvall has described them as, quote, human locusts, stripping cities and countryside bare of all movable resources to sustain their war machine. They're also notorious for what Amnesty International calls horrific and widespread use of sexual violence. And that's before we even get on to the ethnic cleansing carried out by their fighters. The most notorious example prior to Fasher took place in 2023. The early months of the war saw the RSF sweep through city after city, culminating in the crimes that took place in the West Darfur capital of El Geneina. Their two separate massacres targeting the city's mass-lit population are thought to have killed between 10,000 and 15,000 people. As The Guardian reported, decomposing bodies lay out on the streets for up to 10 days on both occasions, their flesh eaten by dogs and chickens.
So, what is being cited as the justification for this fighting, for this, deliberate attack on civilians? And of course, there's going to be resistance fighters, right, that they're fighting against. What has been the argument for that? Especially ones that they may not be directly tied to like jihad, what other things I'm sure there are that they're attempting to use as justification for this violence. What are those arguments going out there? Do you guys know? And do you have credible sources for that from those carrying out these acts? Let's see what it is and see if it holds any water. Be hard to, though, wouldn't it?
To put this in perspective, even the lower bound of 10,000 would be more than the number killed in Srebrenica by Bosnian Serb forces in 1995, an ethnic massacre that is now recognized by the UN as a genocide. Back in the 1990s, it was...
You don't want to be compared to the genocides that happened in the Yugoslav wars, because that's some elite company too, especially in the last 40 years.
All of Srebrenica that finally convinced the international community to act. In the 2020s, though, Al Jazeera barely raised a shrug from the world that was just too focused on Ukraine and Gaza.
U.S. got involved in that
we want
one.
to qualify that statement. This video's goal is not to suggest that those two wars shouldn't have gotten all the airtime that they did.
Sure.
One is the biggest conflict on European soil since
why does it have to be selective, right?
It has the potential to escalate into a war dragging in the whole of NATO. The other involved one of America's closest allies. Nor is our goal to play down the seriousness of crimes committed in these wars. The Russian siege of Mariupol in early 2022 left over 10,000 new graves visible on satellite images, suggesting a death toll to rival Al Jazeera. But we do want to draw your attention to the vast attention deficit between both Ukraine and Gaza on one hand and Sudan on the other. The siege of Mariupol was, rightly, front-page news across the world. The entire Gaza war played out on Twitter and TikTok.
But it doesn't have to be either or, right?
In Al Jazeera, though, you'd have struggled to find an averagely informed person who'd even heard about it. To the international community's credit, the sheer scale of killing in El Fasher seems to have changed all of that. As people who've been covering the Sudan war for years now, it has been remarkable for us to see it finally cutting through. But this video is not titled, "The World is at Last Paying Attention to Sudan, Hooray!" No, it's called "The World Ignored Sudan's Genocide, Now It's Too Late." And for a simple reason, had our leaders not chosen willful blindness these past 31 months, there would be tens of thousands of people who'd be still alive right now.
Remember, hearing the protests in college? Again, we're talking mid to late 2000s, between like 2004 and like 2008 or so. And there was a lot of anti-war protests against the war in Iraq, but usually saw a lot of those same people that were proposing, intervention in Darfur. Now, neither of those succeeded because the war in Iraq went on, and then still, obviously, a lack of intervention. But you actually had like pacifists that were coming out and saying like, no, like, got to do something about it. Maybe it means war of some kind.
There would be tens of thousands of people who'd be still alive right now. When the word intervention crops up, many instinctively recoil, burned by the memories of Iraq and Afghanistan. Many also ask why America should be expected to police the world, risking the lives of its sons and daughters in conflicts that have no direct impact on the homeland. These are not concerns that could be easily hand-waved away. However, that is not to say that there are no answers. The first to note is that intervention in a war like Sudan's need not be military. For all the misery they've unleashed, the RSF are a relatively low-tech force. This is not the Ukraine war, where two opponents are making huge leaps in drone technology in a bid to gain an edge.
Now, the intervention you have seen from the international community maybe is to like send in aid of some kind, which, helps the people in a immediate way by getting like food and water, but obviously doesn't solve the political, religious, ethnic crisis.
A war fought by men in armored 4x4s with gasoline smuggled from Libya in the only semi-advanced kit clandestinely supplied by the United Arab Emirates. Were Abu Dhabi to cut the RSF loose, the war would end. And the UAE is a nation that America has a lot of leverage with. Washington.
Now, of cutting aid, so like indirectly with that, may have heard of people of talk about that, about, like what was going on, like what's going on in Gaza. I've heard a lot of people say that, maybe you have too, that, if the United States was to pull their military aid to like Israel, would that just immediately end the war in Gaza? Or would these just find other types of, funding, and support? Because whether we know, military arms is also a very, very big market, whether done with legitimate companies or on the black market. It seems that those always find a way to get through.
Is Abu Dhabi's security guarantee. It also has the ability to deploy a vast array of sanctions that could be targeted at the Dubai-based gold sellers who help smuggle illegally acquired Sudanese bullion onto the international market, thus funding the RSF. Were the US to publicly crack down on the gold trade while working behind the scenes to exert strong diplomatic pressure on Emirati leadership, it could be enough to force the UAE to abandon the paramilitaries. And it's not like President Trump is shy about pressuring his allies.
It always gets so tight if the United Arab Emirates gets involved, because the UAE is such a business hub for international businesses. I mean, their whole economy is designed to be favorable towards foreign investment. Put your companies there, put your banking there. They're going to bend backwards to please you as a country and get your finances there. But then you get tied in, though, to anything they want to get involved in politically internationally. So when you get something involved like this, that makes it messier.
Second note is that even a military intervention need not be led by America. Again, this is a low-tech desert war. There are powers in Europe, the Middle East,
Usually
and even
is,
Africa
though.
who would be capable of mounting
No one
a
else
limited
really
intervention.
steps up ever,
We've
huh?
used this example before, but in 1995, it took NATO just 3 weeks of bombing to cripple the Bosnian Serb army, forcing it to both lift the siege of Sarajevo and come to the negotiating table for peace talks. For all the fine words from diplomats, no nation or coalition has even floated such a proposal regarding Sudan, and plenty would have been capable of doing so. NATO could have easily broken the Fasher siege and crippled the RSF's war machine just enough for peace talks. Heck, provided some logistical support by the
NATO? Again, how directly tied is NATO going to be, though, economically with that? I mean, the UAE is not part of NATO. Be more indirect. The UN can't enforce anything. They have no enforcing arm. They don't have an army or anything like that.
The RSF's war machine just enough for peace talks. Heck, provided some logistical support by the United States, France could have done so all by itself. Britain could have likewise pulled it off, as could have Russia, which has recently flipped its support from the RSF to the SAF. But why stop at individual countries? The UN could have stepped in and deployed a peacekeeping force. The African Union has previously launched a military intervention in Darfur and could have done so again. Diplomatically, the entire world could have...
What effect did they have in Darfur? I was asking you guys earlier about the African Union to help stop it because it picked back up.
Worked to shame the UAE into ending its support for genocide. In short, there were options, all of them difficult, many unpalatable, some such as unilateral airstrikes, likely of dubious legality. But when you're dealing with a rampaging genocidal group that thinks nothing of slaughtering tens of thousands over their ethnicity alone, should their legal rights trump those of the civilians they're killing? Right now, the world appears to be in a weird place regarding these questions. European nations fret about the legality of confiscating frozen Russian assets, even as Moscow wages an illegal war on their doorsteps. The UN dare not intervene without Security Council agreement, despite the Security Council now being nothing more than a place for veto-wielding nations to theatrically block one another over the precise wording of motions. Meanwhile, the United States has rediscovered hard power, but only seems willing to wield it against close allies.
Now, you do see, like with the Trump administration, you know, President Trump has taken a lot of pride in appearing as a mediator for international conflicts, right? He's cited that he's been instrumental, like Azerbaijan and India, Pakistan and Thailand, Israel and Iran, still working on, you know, Russia, Ukraine and Israel, Gaza. You wonder if this would be something that President Trump would like to get into, but I don't know how much, or, you know, with the people around him, how much they really know about this conflict, how much they know about it, especially because it hasn't tied to the United States. But then again, neither are so many of these other conflicts, you know, that Trump administration has taken sort of credit for. But it seems like this could be one of those opportunities if they want to add to their list.
Even we're surprised to find ourselves out here arguing for a more muscular intervention policy. I'm a British millennial. I remember the Iraq War and the way it made the entire world go, maybe this intervention stuff isn't so brilliant after all.
True.
But what those my age and younger miss is that these interventionist policies were born from a heartfelt place.
Interventionism has gone down as a result of the consequences of like the neocons of the early 2000s, and this idea of you intervene before it shows up on your doorstep type of thing. And that whole mindset has changed in this like next generation. You see it with American conservatives and like the MAGA movement, and how different that idea has been, you know, from the Bushes bookending the millennium there. The whole, it's, you know, now it's not our war thing. Then it becomes problematic, and then genocide's different. Should they be considered different than just a civil war? And where do you draw those lines and where do you create those definitions?
The world had just watched the slaughter in Bosnia and Rwanda and felt deep shame at its inability to stop the killing. Faced with the price of inaction, leaders everywhere had vowed not to make the same mistake again. And yet here we are in 2025 with the pendulum having swung back the other way.
Is it a
and
predicament?
our leaders now able to do nothing more than mutter thoughts and prayers as a genocidal militia carries out
we love
the
to say
wave
that, don't we?
of mass killings
Thoughts
that
and
everyone
prayers.
saw coming, but did nothing to stop.
Oh my gosh, is that what
that
it
a
looked
better
like?
world to live in? Are the lives of tens of thousands in El Fasher worth the embarrassment spared to all the nations who could have tried to diplomatically isolate the UAE? Well, you can tell me. But whether we agree or not on precisely
We're having to
what should
bleep
have been
Simon
done,
today.
we can hopefully agree that something should have happened. Hopefully agree that the fact that the world was being warned for months of an impending massacre in Sudan, including on this very channel, and chose to do nothing, was a deeply shameful thing, a failure of global leadership as great as that which turned a blind eye to the Rwandan genocide. If anything
Fair.
good can come from this horror show in El Fasher, perhaps it can at least be this. At least a permanent reminder to those in charge of the truth of the old adage: the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. In late 2025, nothing is exactly what good men and women of the world chose to do. And now it's the ordinary people of El Fasher who are paying the price.
Final thoughts. It seems to me, and just kind of seeing history unfold over the last few decades, that the answer, or whatever the response that is necessary, has to truly be a global one. But the problem with that is that that never has happened, ever. Things become so divisive. So many countries have policies that are just never, ever get involved in there under any circumstances. So it puts the weight of it into a handful of countries that have also been victims of their interventions making things worse. Right. And I think in this new era, in the 2020s now, the issue is that what is required to have to happen is something that is unprecedented, which is like a true unified global effort where everyone pulls their weight and has a singular voice and a singular plan to end something like this. And not just with what's going down in Sudan. That could be in the Middle East, could be in Eastern Europe, all these places that have conflicts going on. Yeah, and it's kind of sad to think of that we don't have a lot of good historical precedent of how these things can get addressed. And it's only made harder now in this anti-interventionist era that we live in now. So what that means is history, I guess, can't be our motivation for doing this. It actually, we have to make history by doing something here in the future that has never been done in history. I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know down below. We'll see you next time.